The morning sun peeked through the old curtains as Harold Matthews slowly made his way to the kitchen. At 93 years old, he moved carefully but deliberately, his weathered hands gripping his wooden cane. The small house on Cedar Street had been his home for over 5 decades, and even now, 6 months after losing Martha, his wife of 65 years, he kept their daily routines alive. Harold glanced at the empty chair where Martha used to sit, her favorite blue coffee mug still hanging on its designated hook nearby. He couldn't bring himself to move it. The quiet of the house felt heavier these days, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from 1958. Despite his age, Harold maintained a strict schedule. Every morning, he would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m., just as he had done during his military service in World War II. Some habits, he believed, were worth keeping. He carefully prepared his breakfast. 2 pieces of toast, 1 egg, and a cup of black coffee, simple but sufficient, just like his life now. Through the kitchen window, Harold could see his pride and joy, the garden Martha and he had cultivated together over the years. Rows of vegetables grew alongside Martha's beloved roses, their red petals bright against the morning dew. Even though his joints ached more these days, Harold never missed a day of gardening. It was his way of keeping Martha's memory alive. The neighbors often watched with concern as the elderly veteran worked in his garden, but Harold knew what he was doing. His hands might shake while holding his coffee cup, but they were steady as steel when he pruned his roses or pulled weeds. The garden was more than just plants to him. It was his connection to the past and his reason to get up every morning. At 10 a.m., Harold would put on his neat brown jacket, the same one he wore every day, and walk the 3 blocks to Sally's Diner. The young waitresses there knew him well. The usual, Mr. Matthews? They would ask with kind smiles, already knowing the answer. A grilled cheese sandwich and a cup of soup. That had been his lunch order for the past 20 years. Sally, the diner's owner, always made sure Harold had his regular booth by the window. From there, he could watch the small town of Millbrook go about its daily business. He recognized most faces, having lived there long enough to see children grow up and have children of their own. Some would stop by his booth to say hello, especially the veterans who spotted the small World War II pin on his jacket lapel. Back at home, Harold spent his afternoons tending to his garden or sitting in his favorite armchair, looking through old photo albums. Pictures of him and Martha through the years filled the pages. Their wedding day, the birth of their son James, who now lived in California with his own family vacations, and countless Christmas celebrations. Each photo told a story, and Harold knew them all by heart. The neighbors would sometimes bring him casseroles or stop by to check on him, but Harold politely assured them he was managing just fine. His son James called twice a week, always suggesting that Harold move to California to be closer to family. But Harold couldn't leave his house, his garden, or his memories of Martha. As evening approached, Harold would settle into his routine of watching the news and eating a simple dinner. He kept his military medals in a glass case on the living room wall, next to Martha's favorite painting of flowers. The medals reminded him of his strength, of everything he had survived. He had fought in the Pacific, seen things that still haunted his dreams, but had built a peaceful life afterward. Before bed each night, Harold would look out his bedroom window at the quiet street below. The vacant lot next door had been empty for years, collecting weeds and occasional trash. He never imagined that this peaceful corner of his world was about to change dramatically. Tomorrow would bring unexpected visitors who would turn his quiet life upside down, forcing him to draw upon strength he hadn't needed to use in decades. As he turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Harold had no idea that his greatest test, since the war was just around the corner. But for now, in the quiet of his familiar home, he was simply a 93-year-old veteran, holding on to his memories and his dignity, one day at a time. The peaceful morning that Harold Matthews had grown accustomed to was shattered by the roar of motorcycle engines. He nearly dropped his coffee cup as the sound echoed through his small kitchen. Looking out his window, he saw a group of leather-clad bikers pulling into the vacant lot next door. At first, Harold thought they were just passing through, but as the morning went on, more motorcycles arrived. The bikers began unloading equipment from trucks, tables, chairs, and what looked like pieces of a wooden shed. They were setting up some kind of clubhouse right next to his property. "This can't be good," Harold muttered to himself, watching as more than 20 bikers moved about the lot. Their leather vests displayed patches reading Steel Thunder NC, and their loud voices carried across his garden. The peaceful birdsong that usually filled his mornings was now drowned out by revving engines and rough laughter. The largest of the bikers, a muscular man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, seemed to be in charge. The others called him Tank, and he barked orders as they worked. Harold noticed how Tank kept looking over at his house, particularly at his neatly maintained garden, with what appeared to be amusement in his eyes. When Harold stepped out to tend to his roses that afternoon, the noise became even louder. He could smell cigarette smoke drifting over his fence, and empty beer cans had already started appearing in his garden. The bikers seemed to find entertainment in revving their engines whenever Harold bent down to pull weeds. "Hey, old-timer." Tank's voice boomed across the yard. "Better watch out for those thorns. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." The other bikers laughed, and Harold felt his face grow hot with embarrassment and anger. He straightened up as best he could, gripping his garden tools tightly. That evening, when Harold tried to watch his usual news program, the sound was completely drowned out by music blasting from the lot. The bass was so strong it made his windows rattle. Through the glass, he could see the bikers had set up bright lights and were having some kind of party. Sleep was impossible that night. The noise continued until well past midnight, and every time it seemed to die down, another round of motorcycles would arrive, their engines echoing through his bedroom. Harold lay in bed, thinking about Martha and how she would have handled this situation. She always knew what to say in difficult times. The next morning, Harold found tire tracks across the edge of his lawn. Some of his prized tulips had been crushed, and cigarette butts littered his driveway. As he bent to pick up the trash, 3 bikers walked past, deliberately bumping into his mailbox and making it wobble on its post. "Watch where you put that mailbox, old man," one of them sneered. "It's in the way of our bikes." The others laughed, high-fiving each other as they walked away. When Harold went for his daily walk to Sally's diner, he had to weave through parked motorcycles that now lined the street. Inside the diner, conversation stopped as he entered. Several bikers were seated at the counter, their leather vests and loud voices filling the usually peaceful space. Sally, the diner's owner, gave Harold a sympathetic look as she brought his usual grilled cheese. "They've been here all morning," she whispered. "I've never seen anything like it in Millbrook." Harold tried to eat his lunch, but he could feel eyes on him. The bikers at the counter were pointing and snickering, making exaggerated old man movements when they thought he wasn't looking. For the first time in years, Harold left his lunch half finished. Walking home, Harold's military training kicked in as he assessed his situation. These weren't just ordinary troublemakers. They were organized, numerous, and seemed to have chosen this location deliberately. As he passed the lot, Tank stepped out in front of him, forcing Harold to stop. "Nice neighborhood you got here, Pops," Tank said, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "Hope you don't mind if we make ourselves at home." The threat in his words was clear, and Harold felt a familiar tension in his chest, the same feeling he'd had before battles long ago. Back in his house, Harold sat in his armchair, looking at his military medals on the wall. The situation was getting worse by the hour, and he knew he needed to do something. But at 93, what could he possibly do against a gang of bikers who seemed determined to make his life miserable? After a week of constant noise and harassment, Harold Matthews decided he needed to try talking to the bikers. He waited until morning, when there seemed to be fewer of them around. Using his cane for support, he walked slowly but purposefully toward their makeshift clubhouse. Tank was outside, working on his motorcycle. Several other bikers lounged nearby on plastic chairs, drinking beer despite the early hour. As Harold approached, they nudged each other and smirked. "Excuse me," Harold said, keeping his voice steady and polite. "I was hoping we could talk about the noise level, especially at night. You see, I'm an old man, and I need my rest." He tried to smile, remembering how he used to handle difficult situations during his time as a military officer. Tank stood up slowly, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He towered over Harold, moving closer until he was uncomfortably near. "Oh, is that right?" he said, his voice mockingly sweet. "The old-timer needs his beauty sleep." The other bikers laughed. One of them revved his motorcycle engine, making Harold jump slightly. Tank noticed this and grinned. "Tell you what, Gramps," he said. "We'll try to keep it down, when we feel like it." More laughter followed. As Harold turned to leave, he heard Tank call out, "Sweet garden you got there." Be a shame if something happened to it. The threat in his voice was clear as day. The harassment got worse after that. The bikers began parking their motorcycles partly on Harold's lawn, leaving deep tire marks in his carefully maintained grass. They threw their empty cans and food wrappers over his fence. Sometimes they would sit on his front steps, refusing to move when he needed to go out. Harold called the police 3 times that week. Each time, Officer Jenkins would come by, talk to the bikers, and leave without doing anything real to help. "Sorry, Mr. Matthews," he'd say. "They're not technically breaking any laws. Just try to avoid confrontation." One morning, Harold woke up to find all his newspapers from the past week scattered across his front yard. The bikers had apparently stolen them from his porch and torn them apart. As he bent down painfully to pick up the pieces, 3 motorcycles roared past him, so close he could feel the wind from their passing. "Better watch your step, old-timer," one of them shouted, while the others laughed and made engine noises with their mouths. That same afternoon, Harold caught 2 bikers urinating on his rose bushes, Martha's precious roses that he had maintained so carefully since her passing. When they saw him watching from his window, they just waved and laughed. The final straw came when Harold returned from his daily walk to Sally's diner. His mailbox had been knocked completely off its post and was lying in the street, crushed and dented. Next to it lay Martha's blue rose bush, ripped out by its roots, the one she had planted on their 50th wedding anniversary. Through his tears of anger and frustration, Harold noticed Tank watching him from the lot. The biker leader had a satisfied smile on his face as he sipped his beer, clearly enjoying the old veteran's distress. That evening, as Harold sat in his living room listening to the now familiar sound of the bikers' party, something changed inside him. He looked at his military medals on the wall, remembering the young sergeant he had once been. He thought about the battles he had fought, the men he had led, the courage he had shown in the face of real danger. "Enough," he whispered to himself, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. He stood up and walked to his bedroom closet, where a large trunk sat untouched for many years. Inside was his old military uniform, still perfectly preserved. As the noise from the bikers' party grew louder outside, Harold began forming a plan. He might be 93 years old, but he had faced worse enemies than a gang of bullying bikers. Tomorrow, he decided, things would change. He wasn't going to be their victim anymore. Looking in the mirror, Harold saw a glimpse of his younger self, the soldier who had fought for his country, the man who had led others through war. Age had taken many things from him, but it hadn't taken his courage or his dignity. Tomorrow, he would show these bikers exactly who they were dealing with. The morning sun was just rising as Harold Matthews opened the old trunk containing his military uniform. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted out each piece, the jacket with its medals and ribbons, the carefully pressed pants, the polished shoes, and his officer's cap. He hadn't worn them since Martha's funeral 6 months ago. As he lay each item on his bed, loud motorcycle engines roared to life outside. Through his window, he could see Tank and his gang starting their usual morning routine of causing trouble. They had added a new game lately, seeing how close they could ride their bikes to his windows without hitting the house. Harold's eyes fell on the crushed mailbox he had brought inside yesterday. Next to it lay the remains of Martha's special rose bush, its roots torn and flowers crushed. Something inside the old veteran's chest tightened. He had survived the horrors of war, built a peaceful life with Martha, and now these thugs thought they could destroy everything he held dear. Moving to his desk, Harold pulled out an old leather-bound journal. Inside were photographs, yellowed with age, showing him with his military unit in the Pacific. He had been their leader, responsible for 30 young men in the midst of war. Looking at those faces now, Harold remembered how he had earned their respect not through fear, but through understanding and leadership. A crash outside made him jump. Looking through the window, he saw that the bikers had knocked over his garbage cans, spilling trash across his driveway. Tank was laughing, directing 2 younger bikers to throw empty beer bottles at Harold's garage door. "Target practice, old man," Tank shouted, knowing Harold was watching. The bottles shattered against the garage, leaving broken glass everywhere. Harold's hands clenched into fists. He looked back at his uniform on the bed, then at the photos of his unit. Suddenly, he noticed something in one of the old photographs that he hadn't paid attention to before. In the background of one image, he could see military motorcycles lined up, the very ones his unit had used during the war. Moving closer to his window, Harold began watching the bikers more carefully. As Tank ordered his men around, Harold recognized something familiar in their movements, in the way they organized themselves. It reminded him of military structure, of the way his own unit had operated. He noticed how they posted lookouts, how they communicated with hand signals, how they maintained their motorcycles with military precision. These weren't just random thugs, there was something more to them, something he should have seen earlier. Another bottle crashed against his garage. This time, Harold didn't flinch. Instead, he walked to his closet and pulled out a small box he hadn't opened in years. Inside was his Silver Star Medal, awarded for bravery in combat. Next to it lay his dog tags, still on their original chain. As he held these precious items, Harold heard Tank's voice outside again, mocking and cruel. But this time, instead of feeling fear or anger, Harold felt something different: understanding. He had led men like this before, young and angry, trying to prove themselves through intimidation and force. Looking in the mirror, Harold saw not just an old man, but a veteran who had faced worse challenges than this. His back straightened, his chin lifted, and for a moment, he saw himself as he had been all those years ago, a leader of men. The sound of breaking glass came again, followed by loud laughter. Harold nodded at his reflection, a plan forming in his mind. These bikers thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but they were about to meet Sergeant Harold Matthews, decorated war veteran and former platoon leader. With careful, deliberate movements, Harold began to put on his uniform. Each button he fastened, each medal he straightened gave him more strength. The uniform still fit, though a bit looser now than in his younger days. As he placed his officer's cap on his white hair, he heard Martha's voice in his memory. Sometimes, Harold, the best way to fight is not to fight at all. Tomorrow, he decided, he would show these bikers exactly who they had been tormenting. But he wouldn't do it with anger or violence. He would do it the way he had led his men in war, with courage, dignity, and understanding. After all, he thought, as he straightened his last medal, sometimes the greatest victory comes from turning enemies into friends. The next morning, Harold woke up earlier than usual. Instead of putting on his regular clothes, he carefully dressed in his military uniform. As he adjusted his medals in front of the mirror, he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles outside. Through his window, Harold watched the bikers with new eyes. Tank was directing 3 younger members as they unloaded supplies from a truck. Harold noticed how they responded immediately to Tank's hand signals, signals that looked very similar to the ones Harold had used with his own unit during the war. Taking his time, Harold studied their movements. One biker was checking all the motorcycles in a systematic way, just like military vehicle inspections. Another was keeping watch from a specific position, rotating with others every 30 minutes, exactly like military guard duty. How did I miss this before? Harold whispered to himself. He pulled out his old binoculars from his military trunk and looked more closely at the bikers' vests. Among their regular patches, he spotted something interesting: military unit insignias sewn carefully onto the leather. Through the binoculars, Harold could now read some of the patches. There was Afghanistan veteran on one vest, Iraq War on another. He even spotted Marine Corps and Army Rangers patches on several others. These weren't just ordinary troublemakers, they were veterans themselves. Harold watched as Tank took off his leather jacket because of the heat. On his arm was a distinctive tattoo, the emblem of the 101st Airborne Division, the same division Harold had worked with during some of the toughest battles in the Pacific. Moving to different windows in his house, Harold continued his observation. He noticed how the bikers had organized their space just like a military camp. Their supplies were stored exactly as military supplies would be. Even their motorcycles were parked in a formation that reminded him of military vehicle arrangements. At one point, Harold saw 2 of the younger bikers arguing. Tank stepped in, and Harold could read his lips as he said something about unit discipline and respect for the chain of command. These were military phrases, words Harold himself had used countless times. Later that morning, a delivery truck tried to enter the lot. Before it could get close, 2 bikers moved into position, checking the driver's ID and inspecting the truck's contents. It was standard military security procedure, performed almost unconsciously. Harold sat down in his armchair, thinking hard about everything he had seen. These men weren't just copying military behavior, they were acting on years of training and experience. They were soldiers who had traded their uniforms for leather vests, but they hadn't lost their military precision. Looking at an old photograph of his own unit, Harold remembered how lost some of his men had felt after the war, how hard it had been for them to fit back into normal society, how they had needed the structure and brotherhood they'd found in the military. Through his window, Harold saw Tank helping a younger biker fix his motorcycle. The way Tank was teaching him, patient and detailed, reminded Harold of how he used to train new recruits. There was a gentleness there that contradicted Tank's tough exterior. At lunchtime, Harold noticed something else. The bikers shared their food, making sure everyone ate before the leaders did, another military tradition. They even had someone posted as a lookout while the others ate, just like in combat situations. One of the younger bikers dropped his plate, spilling his food. Instead of laughing, the others quickly helped him clean up and shared their own food with him. It was the kind of solidarity Harold had seen countless times during the war, soldiers taking care of their own. As evening approached, Harold made his final preparations for tomorrow. His plan had changed now that he understood who he was dealing with. These weren't just bullies to be confronted. They were lost soldiers who had found their own way to maintain the brotherhood they missed from their service days. Looking at his reflection in the mirror, Harold straightened his medals one last time. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be facing enemies. He would be reaching out to fellow veterans who had lost their way. As their elder in both age and service, he had a duty to help them remember the true meaning of military honor and respect. "Martha," he said quietly to his wife's picture, "I think I finally understand what's really going on here, and I know exactly what needs to be done." Tank stood silently for a long moment, looking at Harold in his crisp military uniform. Then, to everyone's surprise, the big biker leader suddenly straightened his back and raised his right hand in a perfect military salute. "Sergeant First Class James Tank Wilson, 101st Airborne Division, sir," he said formally. His voice had changed, losing its mocking tone. Now it carried the respectful tone of a soldier addressing a superior officer. Harold returned the salute with precise military form. Around them, other bikers began to stand straighter, their military training showing through their tough biker appearance. "My grandfather served in the Pacific," Tank said quietly, lowering his hand. "He was with the 5th Marines. Used to tell me stories." He paused, his eyes focusing on one of Harold's medals. "Sir, is that a silver star?" Harold nodded. "Guadalcanal, 1943. Our unit was pinned down. I had to ride my motorcycle through enemy fire to deliver critical messages. Lost 2 good friends that day." The bikers gathered closer, their faces showing genuine interest. One of them, a younger man with an Iraq War veteran patch, spoke up. "You rode combat motorcycles, sir? My grandfather told me about those units, but I've never met anyone who actually served in one." "We didn't have fancy bikes like yours," Harold said with a small smile, "but those machines kept us alive more times than I can count. Had to maintain them ourselves, just like you boys do with yours." Tank moved closer to Harold, his face troubled. "Sir, about your garden and the mailbox, He stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "A good soldier admits his mistakes, son," Harold said gently, "and a great leader shows his men how to make things right." Tank nodded slowly, then turned to face his men. "All right, listen up." His voice carried the authority of a military commander. "We've dishonored ourselves and everything we fought for. Time to make it right." To Harold's amazement, the bikers immediately began moving with purpose. Some started picking up trash from his yard, while others carefully gathered the broken pieces of his mailbox. Tank himself walked over to Martha's uprooted rose bush, examining it with genuine concern. "Sir," Tank said, returning to Harold, "my uncle's a landscaper. He can help us save this rose bush if we act quick, and we'll fix everything else we damaged. You have my word as a soldier." One of the older bikers stepped forward. "Those medals you're wearing, sir, they represent the best of what we're supposed to be. We forgot that somewhere along the way." Harold looked at the men working in his yard, seeing them now not as troublemakers, but as fellow veterans who had lost their way. "Sometimes," he said, "we all need a reminder of who we really are." As the morning went on, more bikers arrived, but instead of bringing noise and chaos, they brought tools and supplies. Tank had called in everyone to help repair the damage they had done. The transformation was remarkable. Where there had been rowdy bikers, now there were disciplined veterans working together with military precision. Harold watched as Tank organized the men into teams, using the same hand signals he had noticed before. But now, they weren't being used to cause trouble. They were coordinating a restoration effort. "Sir," Tank said, approaching Harold again, "there's something else you should know." He hesitated, then continued. "My grandfather, he served in your unit. James Wilson Sr. He used to tell me stories about a brave sergeant who led the motorcycle squadron. I never made the connection until now." Harold's eyes widened. He remembered James Wilson, a young Marine who had saved his life during a particularly fierce battle. "Your grandfather. He was one of the bravest men I ever knew." Tears appeared in Tank's eyes. "He passed away last year, but he always said that his time in the service taught him what real brotherhood meant. We started this club to find that brotherhood again, but somewhere along the way, we forgot what it really stood for." Looking at his transformed front yard, where former enemies now worked together like a well-oiled military unit, Harold realized that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating an enemy, but from helping lost soldiers find their way home. 2 months had passed since the day Harold confronted the bikers in his military uniform. The change in the neighborhood was remarkable. The vacant lot next to his house, once a source of chaos, had been transformed into something special. The Steel Thunder NC still gathered there, but now their clubhouse looked more like a veterans' meeting hall. They had built a proper building, painted it neatly, and even added a flagpole where both the American flag and a POW/MIA flag flew proudly. The noise level had dropped considerably, and the bikers made sure their activities never disturbed Harold's peace. Every morning, Harold would find at least 2 members of the club checking on his garden. Tank had kept his word. They had not only saved Martha's rose bush, but had helped it thrive better than ever. The mailbox they had destroyed was replaced with a custom-made one, decorated with military emblems representing both Harold's service and their own. On this particular morning, Harold sat in his usual booth at Sally's Diner, but he wasn't alone anymore. Several bikers, including Tank, regularly joined him for breakfast. They listened intently as he shared stories from his service days, eager to learn from his experiences. "You should have seen him on that motorcycle, boys," Harold was saying, describing one of his wartime missions. "Your grandfather," he nodded to Tank, "rode through enemy fire like he was born on that bike." Tank smiled proudly, wearing a cleaned-up version of his leather vest that now displayed his military patches more prominently than his club patches. The other bikers at the table wore similar vests, their military service honors displayed with renewed pride. The biggest change, however, was visible every Wednesday evening. The Steel Thunder MC had started a veteran support group that met in their new clubhouse. They welcomed veterans from all eras and branches of service, providing a place where military men and women could find the brotherhood they missed from their service days. Harold had become their unofficial advisor. His presence brought a sense of history and wisdom to their meetings. Young veterans, fresh from recent conflicts, found comfort in talking with someone who understood their experiences, even though his own service had been decades ago. "You know what's funny?" Tank said to Harold as they walked back from the diner. "We thought we were tough guys, causing all that trouble, but real toughness was what you showed us, standing up to us with dignity and honor instead of anger." The club had also started a community service program, helping other veterans in need. They fixed houses, repaired cars, and provided support to military families. The tough bikers had found a new mission, one that honored their military background instead of tarnishing it. That afternoon, Harold watched from his porch as Tank taught a young veteran how to properly maintain his motorcycle. The lessons often turned into therapy sessions, with Tank using his own experiences to help others deal with their transition back to civilian life. "Looking good out there?" Harold called to them, and both men waved back with respect. His garden, once a target for vandalism, had become a gathering place where veterans could sit and talk, finding peace among the flowers Martha had loved so much. As the sun began to set, Harold heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. But now, instead of causing anxiety, the sound brought comfort. It meant his new family was nearby, fellow veterans who had found their way back to the values they had sworn to uphold. That evening, as Harold prepared for bed, he looked at Martha's picture on his nightstand. "You were right, my dear," he said softly. "Sometimes the best way to fight is not to fight at all. Sometimes it's about helping others remember who they really are. From his window, he could see the lights of the clubhouse, where another veterans' meeting was wrapping up. The sight of young and old veterans walking together, supporting each other, filled his heart with pride. What had started as a conflict had become a mission of healing and brotherhood. Tank's voice carried across the quiet evening as he bid goodbye to the last of the meeting attendees. Same time next week, brothers. And remember, honor, respect, and service. That's what we stand for now. Harold smiled as he turned away from the window. At 93, he had found a new purpose, a new family, and a new way to serve. Sometimes, he thought, the greatest victories in life come not from defeating enemies, but from turning them into friends. The morning sun glinted off Harold's medals as he stood in front of his mirror one final time. His uniform, pressed and perfect, made him stand straighter despite his 93 years. The silver star on his chest caught the light, reminding him of the courage it had taken to earn it. Outside, the bikers were already gathering. Their motorcycles roared as usual, but today Harold didn't flinch at the sound. Instead, he picked up his officer's cap, placed it carefully on his white hair, and grabbed his cane. It was time. Tank and about 20 other bikers were in the lot when Harold stepped out of his house. At first, nobody noticed him. Then one biker looked up, did a double take, and elbowed his neighbor. Like dominoes, the bikers fell silent one by one until only the idling motorcycles could be heard. Harold walked slowly but confidently toward them, his medals clicking softly against each other. His cane tapped steadily on the ground with each step. The bikers parted automatically, creating a path for him, an unconscious response to the authority his uniform represented. Tank stood at the center of the group, his usual smirk frozen on his face as Harold approached. The old veteran stopped directly in front of him, their eyes meeting. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. At ease, soldiers, Harold said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet lot. The words had an immediate effect. Several bikers straightened their backs automatically, muscle memory from their service days taking over. Harold looked around the group, making eye contact with each man. "I see the 101st Airborne patch on your arm, Tank," he said clearly. "I fought alongside your division in the Pacific. Good men, all of them. Brave men." Tank's expression changed, surprise replacing his usual sneer. His hand unconsciously moved to touch the patch on his leather vest. "I served with the 5th Marine Division," Harold continued, pointing to one of his medals. "Fought in some of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. Lost good men. Saved some too, just like you all did in Iraq and Afghanistan." The bikers exchanged glances. Harold could see recognition dawning in their eyes as they looked more closely at his medals and insignias. "You know what my commanding officer told me once?" Harold asked, his voice growing stronger. "He said that a true soldier's duty doesn't end when the war does. It continues in how we treat others, in how we honor the sacrifice of those who serve beside us." Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, weathered photograph. "This was my unit," he said, holding it up. "Every morning, I look at their faces and remember what we fought for. Freedom, yes, but also dignity, respect, the things that make us better than those we fought against." Tank stepped forward, taking the photograph carefully in his hands. Other bikers crowded around to look. In the image, a young Harold stood with his unit, their motorcycles lined up behind them. "You rode bikes too?" one of the younger bikers asked, his voice filled with surprise. "Military police squadron," Harold replied. "Those motorcycles got us through some tough spots, saved more lives than I can count." Harold turned to face Tank directly. "You're their leader now, just like I was back then. Those men look up to you. The question is, what are you leading them toward? Honor or shame?" Tank's face reddened, but Harold could see the impact of his words. The big man's eyes kept moving between the photograph and Harold's medals. "My late wife Martha used to say that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is admit when he's wrong," Harold continued. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here as a fellow veteran, asking you to remember who you really are." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the soft rumble of idling motorcycles. Harold stood straight, his officer's bearing clear despite his age, waiting for Tank's response. Finally, Tank cleared his throat. The tough biker leader looked different now, younger somehow, more like the soldier he had once been, He looked at Harold's photograph one more time, then handed it back with surprising gentleness. What happened next would change everything, but at that moment, Harold simply stood his ground, showing these lost veterans what real military bearing looked like. Sometimes, he knew, the boldest move isn't charging forward, it's standing firm and showing others the way back to who they were meant to be.